Most of you watching think this is just another economic panic video, another dramatic prediction that will disappear tomorrow like smoke in the wind. I once believed the same thing, that financial catastrophe warnings were exaggerated narratives designed to scare investors, attract views, and fuel speculation. That belief died 3 hours ago. I've spent 30 years inside global finance. I've served as a minister, negotiated with the Troika, sat across from central bankers with the power to collapse nations in a single afternoon. And yet, nothing in my career prepared me for what I saw today. If what I say does not begin unfolding within 48 hours, record this moment, screenshot this frame, expose my name across every corner of the internet, because I'm willing to stake my professional reputation on what follows. 3 hours ago, a secure communique triggered encrypted alerts across international banking channels normally reserved for wartime economic coordination. A G7 emergency summit was convened with language that has never been used publicly. Internal labels referenced contingency protocol Omega. That phrase is code for economic warfare procedures. This is not diplomacy, it's not negotiation, it's preemptive defense planning. The global financial structure shifted beneath your feet while you slept. Americans woke up unaware that their retirement portfolios, savings accounts, and home equity had already begun bleeding. Not because of inflation, recession, or unemployment, but because global power blocks initiated a synchronized retreat from dollar assets. Nearly $3,400 evaporated from the average U.S. household's portfolio before dawn, and the trigger was a single signature. 3 hours ago, Donald Trump authorized Executive Order 15087. The world believes this is just another tariff escalation. The truth is far more catastrophic. The document authorizes economic siege warfare, freezing dollar settlement access, restricting correspondent banking rights, threatening sanctions not only on adversaries but on any nation trading with them: China, Russia, Iran, and every country conducting business in their orbit. $47 trillion in global annual commerce was effectively designated hostile, but the danger runs deeper. The order permits secondary financial penalties. This means a French bank dealing with a German bank dealing with a Chinese entity could lose dollar access. One domino collapses an entire financial ecosystem. Minutes later, the European Central Bank responded. Christine Lagarde issued an unprecedented condemnation, calling the policy economic terrorism and a violation of sovereign trade rights. The reaction across markets was instant. Currency exchanges triggered volatility halts. Asian indexes free fell. Gold futures spiked beyond programmed band limits. While Europe escalated diplomatic objections, Russia activated de-dollarization defense protocols designed for coordinated settlement bypass. Xi Jinping summoned an urgent Politburo session. They understood what many Americans still fail to grasp. Global finance depends on trust and cooperation. When cooperation collapses, reserve currencies fail. Meanwhile, inside the White House, panic erupted. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned Trump directly that weaponizing reserve currency status could accelerate its abandonment. Trump exploded. He accused Powell of treasonous instability. Strategists described the scene as unprecedented internal fracture. The crisis deepened when Mitch McConnell's office issued a distancing statement. When institutional pillars defect from their own president's economic agenda, investors read that movement as systemic collapse. America began to appear economically radioactive, but the true shock was yet to come. Across Brussels, an extraordinary session of European finance ministers unveiled plans for a parallel global settlement mechanism, a financial infrastructure engineered to operate independently of the dollar, capable of settling cross-border payments without U.S. banking networks. This wasn't improvisation. The architecture had been developed quietly for years, awaiting a moment of necessity. Trump's executive order triggered activation. Russia's swift alternative linked into Europe's instant settlement system. China prepared to route trade through digital yuan frameworks. Central banks began offloading U.S. Treasury reserves in coordinated, patterned divestment, not panic selling, but strategic withdrawal. The mathematics behind reserve currency status is unforgiving. The dollar is valuable not because of landmass, military power, or political ideology, but because the world chooses to transact with it. Remove international willingness to use the dollar, and trillions evaporate instantly from American purchasing power, not by market panic, but by structural abandonment. Capital is loyal only to stability. When the United States weaponizes access to its currency, even allies begin calculating exit strategies. Those calculations are underway right now. Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, multinational banks, and foreign governments are evaluating the risk of holding assets controlled by a political actor who can revoke access by decree. Once those institutions conclude that the cost of remaining inside the dollar system exceeds the cost of leaving it, the transition becomes irreversible. You cannot rebuild trust once it is broken. You cannot force global cooperation through threats. The next 48 hours will determine whether global leaders coordinate a response that stabilizes dollar confidence or whether the world accelerates toward reserve currency fragmentation. If coordination fails, sovereign reserve portfolios will realign toward alternative blocks. Emerging markets will diversify away from the dollar, and America will experience the largest capital flight in its history. If the United States loses reserve currency status, every American, regardless of income, ideology, or geography, will suffer consequences. Retirement accounts, housing equity, consumer prices, borrowing capacity, and social program solvency all depend on foreign demand for dollars. This crisis is not ideological, it is arithmetic. I learned during Greece's financial collapse how economic warfare annihilates negotiation power. We had no alternatives. Our banking lifelines were controlled externally. What Trump has done now is far more destructive. He has initiated economic warfare not against an enemy but against the system that sustains American power. If I am wrong, remind me forever. Quote this video. Show the world that Yanis Varoufakis misread the most important economic moment of the century. But if I am right, remember this moment, because the end of American economic hegemony will not arrive with explosions and headlines, but with quiet abandonment, quiet migration of capital, quiet restructuring of trade, quiet collapse of trust. The clock is ticking, and global cooperation, the foundation of modern prosperity, is fracturing before your eyes. The cracks did not appear in headlines. They appeared in spreadsheets, in server logs of clearinghouses, in liquidity anomalies inside cross-border payment rails. In Tokyo, overnight repo desks extended collateral requirements without announcement. Traders whispered about silent liquidity rationing. No one wanted exposure to assets priced in weapons-grade currency. In Frankfurt, Deutsche Bank's risk algorithms triggered automated de-risking protocols for dollar swap lines. Not because anyone issued direct orders, but because internal models calculated the probability of reserve status volatility crossing a forbidden threshold. In Singapore, sovereign wealth fund advisors began emergency consultations. Documents circulated discussing accelerated diversification, a euphemism for controlled retreat. These were not reactions to panic. These were institutional moves based on predictive modeling. The world understood what Washington refused to acknowledge. Once reserve currency trust begins eroding, contagion spreads at the speed of settlement transfers. Inside the Pentagon, analysts raised silent alarms, not economic alarms, national security alarms, because American military projection relies not only on weapons, but on the financial system backing those weapons. A weakened dollar constrains defense budgets. A collapsing dollar shatters geopolitical influence. Meanwhile, pressure mounted inside the Oval Office. Advisors urged diplomacy. Trump refused. He equated compromise with surrender, negotiation with humiliation. He doubled down. A late-night presidential memorandum drafted language authorizing retaliatory sanctions on European banks participating in the settlement alternative. The draft leaked. European leaders interpreted the move not as negotiation, but as escalation. At 2:19 a.m. Brussels time, the European Parliament Emergency Subcommittee finalized activation authorizations for the parallel system. That single timestamp marked a turning point in economic history, the moment when allies prepared to build a world without American financial primacy. In Beijing, the timing was perfect. China unveiled plans to accelerate global launch of its digital settlement currency, bypassing SWIFT, bypassing dollar liquidity requirements, bypassing US jurisdiction entirely. Russian media celebrated. Iranian state networks called it liberation. But European media did something far more consequential. They framed it as necessity, not rebellion, not ideological opposition. A rational response to American unpredictability. Narratives shape markets, and that narrative signaled the collapse of confidence. Inside Wall Street firms, risk desks ran catastrophic stress tests. Models projected price dislocations unseen since 1929. Internal memos warned of cascading margin calls, liquidity droughts, and collateral shortages. Investment banks quietly instructed analysts to model post-dollar reserve scenarios. Meanwhile, average Americans slept unaware that the foundations of their economic prosperity, retirement funds, credit markets, mortgage rates, depended on global trust rapidly evaporating. Foreign investors began discreetly unwinding treasury positions. Bond markets showed yield fluctuations inconsistent with conventional risk premiums. Credit default swaps on U.S. sovereign debt ticked upward, barely perceptible to the public, but unmistakable to institutional traders. The unraveling had begun. At 5:02 a.m. Eastern Time, futures markets reflected the first tremors of structural abandonment. It wasn't panic selling, it was repositioning for a post-dollar global order. Inside the IMF, internal divisions erupted. The managing director faced an impossible dilemma: defend American primacy or preserve global stability. Either decision risked fracturing the institution beyond repair. In backchannel diplomatic exchanges, European diplomats proposed emergency frameworks for trade settlement diversification. Latin American nations signaled interest. African central banks requested observer access to the alternative payment infrastructure. For the first time since World War II, the world considered a future without American monetary leadership. Meanwhile, Trump prepared a public broadcast, not to reassure markets, not to stabilize confidence, but to declare defiance. Draft excerpts indicated threats of retaliatory sanctions against all hostile financial actors. That language, if spoken publicly, would accelerate abandonment beyond diplomatic containment. Economic advisors begged for restraint. Officials warned of catastrophic consequences. Yet those warnings came from institutions Trump had spent years labeling enemies. He no longer trusted them. He trusted power. The markets understood and reacted accordingly. The Treasury Department scrambled to prepare capital controls contingency plans. The Federal Reserve modeled liquidity guarantees never tested at scale. Analysts questioned whether sovereign default, even theoretical, had entered scenario planning. When reserve currency trust collapses, there is no gradual decline. There is only acceleration. Capital flees not toward opportunity, but toward safety. And when safety no longer exists in America, the world must build it elsewhere. The transition becomes irreversible, not because the world rejected the dollar, but because the United States rejected cooperation. If I am wrong, time will expose my error. But if I am right, the coming days will mark the beginning of a quiet revolution, the end of financial hegemony, not through war, but through mathematics, through trust abandoned rather than seized, through systems redesigned not through force, but through necessity. Remember this moment. History rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly. It changes everything before anyone realizes what has happened. The silence before collapse is the loudest warning of all. I learned during Greece's financial collapse how economic warfare annihilates negotiation power. We had no alternatives. Our banking lifelines were controlled externally. What Trump has done now is far more destructive. He has initiated economic warfare not against an enemy, but against the system that sustains American power. If I am wrong, remind me forever. Quote this video. Show the world that Yanis Varoufakis misread the most important economic moment of the century. But if I am right, remember this moment. Because the end of American economic hegemony will not arrive with explosions and headlines, but with quiet abandonment, quiet migration of capital, quiet restructuring of trade, quiet collapse of trust. The clock is ticking. And global cooperation, the foundation of modern prosperity, is fracturing before your eyes.